we had. It was very stimulating. We had the two guest speakers, the Honorable former Minister of Health, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, who coalesced everything about macroeconomics and the state of macroeconomics in South Africa. And the second keynote speaker, Professor Suklal, who was absolutely brilliant in the sense that he showed his passion and the experience that he's had being ambassador to BRICS and Asia with regards to the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. So yesterday was scintillating. It was very awe-inspiring. It was informative. It provoked a lot of discourse, a lot of argument. Some of the arguments even persisted this morning at breakfast. And the questions still prevail about whether or not China and India, whether they are driving trade in a mutualistic way. So hopefully today we'll bring some answers to those questions, and we can really come with some sort of points to take away from this workshop, points to work on, right? Nodes of thought, nodes of African thought with regard to trade and investment. So let's hope that this day is, a good experience for all concerned, and that we are more knowledgeable for it. Okay, colleagues, without any further ado, I just want to present Professor, we referred to as the father of the faculty yesterday, right? Professor Tiwari, who made all of this possible. Prof. Tiwari will chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, colleagues, friends, and delegates. It's second day, so not much formality. We directly go into the workshop discussion. We have a little change in the plan. We want to finish everything discussion by 12 o'clock, including both the sessions. And then 12 to 1, we want to have a general discussion, all the issues that have developed in this 2 days workshop. Okay, so every candidate will get less time. So I request that the candidate don't discuss too much in introduction or come to the gist or answer what is the conclusion of the paper. Okay, spend more time there rather than what is happening most of the time. People talk about introduction, methodology, and by the time results and discussion, there's no time. So I think results and discussion we should keep more time for that. And that's the key thing. So I'm gonna give you maybe 15 minutes, not more than 15 minutes. This morning, the first presentation is by Mr. James O'Neill Ivere from University of Port Harcourt, Nigeria. And the title is China's Trade and Investment in Africa, a New Era of Trade Development. Are you here? I'm sure it's an online presentation. James, are you here? We have no. Okay, so we didn't receive any slide from him. Okay, all right, then we have to pass. Then we go to next. Dr. Marvelous is here, I'm sure. He was here yesterday. Yes. Okay, so Dr. Marvelous, you have two presentations, analyzing China, Africa's degree of economic integration, a wavelet approach. And then you have other one, forecasting China, Africa economic integration using wavelet and ARIMA hybrid approach. So maybe you come here and your presentation. We give you 30 minutes for both. Thank you.
Good morning to you all. As Prof have just indicated my title, the first paper, we're trying to analyze the evolution of China, Africa's degree of integration. So this is my outline. I'll give a very brief introduction. Then from there, I'll go on to look at what literature versus data tells us about this economic integration. I won't dwell much on the empirical strategy. Then I'll go to the results and the conclusion. Then the question that we ought to answer or to ask ourselves is, all of a sudden, why China? It has been Europe, it has been America for the past years, but now it's China. Presentations that have been presented yesterday here, they show that the relationship of China and Africa dates back to 1950s. But if you go through the literature, it would show you that by the 1950s up to around the 1990s, it was more of a political support to the African countries than economic support. So starting from 2000 up to current, you see that there have been a significant surge of Chinese economic activities in Africa. Exports to China have increased very, very considerably. Imports from China, then loans from China, and also the foreign direct investment from China, which has increased quite significantly. So what is mind-boggling now is that why this surge? Why now? Why since 2000? Why was it not the case when this relationship started to emerge in early 1950s? So literature has tried to answer this question. And because of the bilateral and multilateral pacts that have been signed between China and Africa, they have tried to link these pacts to the surge of the Chinese economic activities in Africa. Yesterday, we talked about the FOCAC, which was established in 2000. And if you look at the rate at which the Chinese economic activities increased from 2000, one might actually be tempted to say, well, FOCAC worked in trying to strengthen the relationship, the economic relationship between the two economies, Africa and China. By the end of 2012, China had signed bilateral investment protection pacts with about 32 African countries, and it has also established a mechanism of a joint economic and trade commission with about 45 African countries. And also the China One Belt, One Road initiative of the 2014, which was launched to develop the infrastructure, hard infrastructure development, but mainly connectivity between Africa and Asia, specifically China, to move Chinese goods out of Africa. In and out of Africa, of course. Then, what data is saying? Data tells us that Chinese economic activities are concentrated in very few African countries. These are the top 10 recipients of the Chinese financial flows, with most of the financial flows going to Angola. You can see most of the exports there. The discrepancy is quite significant. Angola is the first, followed by South Africa, Congo, Zambia, DRC. And if we look at the profile of these countries, they are the resource-rich countries in Africa. Resource-rich. Then in terms of South Africa, I always put a star when I'm analyzing the relationship between Africa and China, because South Africa is a dual benefit from this integration. Besides the bilateral relationship that China and Africa, yes, it also benefit from the BRICS Pact. So there might be other pacts that are benefiting South Africa in that case. So you find that South Africa, it stands as the major recipient of Chinese investment. I'll show you in a graph later. And also, most of the imports of China, they come to South Africa more than the other countries. But here, I'm concentrating on the inflows of capital, taking into account the demand of physical capital that we have in Africa. So I'll concentrate on exports, I'll concentrate on loans, I'll concentrate on financial FDI. We do not have considerable data that traces the evolution of Chinese financial aid. Most of the data that we get is still quite ambiguous anyway. Right, so what is the motive? The narrative derived from literature gives an impression that following FOCAC and BRIPACs, China financial flows to Africa is increased across a considerable number of African countries. But nonetheless, data indicates that China financial flows to Africa are concentrated in just a few African countries. So in light of this discrepancy, we thought that it is meaningful to analyze the degree of economic integration between China and Africa as a whole. The current study argues this is the hypothesis that is derived from both the literature and the data. So what we argue is that if indeed these bilateral and multilateral paths intensified the integration between China and Africa, so the integration indicator should show a long-run upward trend with the less noise, with the less distraction. Otherwise, it means this relationship should be investigated exploratorily to actually unpack some of the hidden aspects which are inherent to this integration. So the empirical strategy that we use, first, we estimate the degree of economic integration using general statistical approach that have been used by other studies. Most of the studies have used an aggregate, in fact, arithmetic mean of the total inflows to that country. But looking at Fig 1, the fig that I displayed in my introduction, is quite a large discrepancy between Chinese FDI to Africa, Chinese loans to Africa, and the exports to China. So if we take an arithmetic mean of all these inflows, we are likely to have biased indication of the degree of economic integration, because all these small amounts will push the bigger amount to an average, which might be quite less than what is expected. So what we did is just to pick the highest inflow, which is of course are the exports to China. Then we will use the mechanical distribution to measure the degree of economic integration as proposed by Adasadzi in 2017, where less than 33% implies low degree of economic integration, between 33 to 66% average, and over 66%, it's high degree of integration. This degree of integration, it relates to the participation of the recipient country. So in the evolution, to trace the evolution of the economic integration, we then use the export growth as a percentage in the wavelet analysis. And like what I indicated before, this is our now hypothesis. China-Africa bilateral pacts have a significant impact on the periodic evolution of Africa's degree of economic integration. So failure to accept, it means we have to analyze this integration from the exploratory point of view. Right, like what I said, that I won't dwell much on the empirical analysis, but for those who want to know how the wavelet analysis work, I'm free to provide the paper, and also I'm free to share its advantages over the classical statistical methods. Right. The results of the Africa's degree of integration with China. So what we did is, let's take Africa, China, Africa as a whole. These are the results, 1.65% from 1992 to 2019. Then let's take Angola and China, 14.35%. Then let's take China and the top 10 recipient countries of Chinese financial flows, 2.76%. And we illustrated also in graph. We can see that the integration between, the degree of integration between China and Africa depends on the top 10 recipient of Chinese financial flows, but also generally depends on the what? On the Angola model, the China-Angola transactions. So it means that we cannot talk about China-Africa relationship without talking about Angola. Right, we go further now to do the wavelet analysis to try and analyze if there is noise in this data. And we find that indeed there is noise in this data. And therefore we couldn't accept our now hypothesis that China-Africa relationship is determined by the pacts that they sign, especially the FOCAC and the degree. And therefore, for us to unpack the written agenda within the China and Africa relationship, we have to use the exploratory means. Here is our exploratory means. Based on the findings of the degree of economic integration, we tried to unpack what is it that is within the Angola model. So this is a term that was initiated by the World Bank to acknowledge the success of the infrastructure for resource China-Angola bilateral barter economic cooperation. Prof. Suklak indicated this barter issue yesterday. Then, so in light of the Angola model, it is expected to find Angola as the Africa's largest exporter of oil to China and Africa's largest recipient of Chinese loans provision for hard infrastructure development. While the former, Angola being the largest exporter, is true, but the latter is not. Most of the loans tailored towards Angola from China they are more meant for mining than hard infrastructure projects. We get this from this graph. This yellow portion, it indicates loans that were tailored towards the mining sector. Then the blue in this portion, it indicates the loans that were tailored towards road infrastructure and towards energy infrastructure. So what can be derived from these results is that China is marketing its loan, hiding on the infrastructure development agenda, because that's what we need. That's what we are making in Africa, hard infrastructure development. And with this free trade agenda that we have, they are actually coming through it to say we can help through the road and the belt initiative. We can help you build the roads. We can help you build the power stations. We can help you improve your communication infrastructure. But that's not the case. It's just a hiding pillar, what they are targeting for and the natural resources. I also gave a small analysis of the FDI inflows. They also flow towards resource-rich countries, South Africa being the major recipient of Chinese FDI inflows, followed by DRC, Zambia, up to Zimbabwe. And an analysis shows that 29% of these inflows, they go to construction, and mostly the construction of roads. Why the construction of roads? Number one, to move for the quick movement, efficient and effective movement of natural resources from Africa to China. And number two, for the efficiency of their bringing on their machineries for whatever the production that they are doing under the mining industry, construction. 25%, of course, it goes to the mining. And the rest is when it goes to the 13% manufacturing, financial intermediary, which is quite insignificant. Right. Here's our conclusion based on this paper. Contrary to what the literature tells us, our findings suggest that interpreting the evolution of Africa's economic integration with China based predominantly on the agreements that they do can mislead policy development. The interpretation should rather be exploratorily driven to unpack some hidden motives attached to the integration. So our exploratory investigation reveals these three vital aspects. Number one, Africa's economic integration with China is biased towards Angola. And China tends to have implemented the economic integration elements of the Angola model in other resource-rich African countries. Number two, China seems to be marketing its loans in exchange for hard infrastructure development, yet targeting natural resources. The infrastructure for resources rhetoric is therefore rife with misrepresentation. We therefore suggest with this evidence that it is reasonable to adjust the rhetoric to Chinese loans for resources. Then the participation of African countries in this integration has remained poor, while China has been pragmatic in its approach. So in light of these findings, it is meaningful to argue that China-Africa economic integration is perpetuated to exploit natural resources more than to enhance hard infrastructure development in Africa as purported. Still on hard infrastructure development, I must make a point that there are some cases that proves the quality of infrastructure being delivered by the China that is very poor. We've got a case of a road that was built from the Chirundu border post up to Kolwezi border post, border Zambia and DRC, border Zimbabwe. That road has been built by the China through the loans that they funded. Less than 10 years, but now you won't like to use that road. It's already dilapidated. Trucks no longer travel at night because it's causing high rate of accidents. There are actually ridges inside of the road, a road that is less than 10 years. And we are talking about close to 1,000 kilometer stretch of a road, which was funded using Chinese roads. poor quality. Zanzibar Airport, when it was at the completion stage, engineers failed to approve it. They refused because of the poor quality. They have to start designing it from the scratch. Some of these cases that, in as much as they are saying infrastructure development, but it seems to be just a hiding thing, because that's what Africa needs. Okay, this is my first paper. So I'm continuing to the second paper, and I won't say much background on the second paper because the background text from this paper is more like of in forecasting of this integration. Now, can you help me go to that? Right. So in the second paper, we are trying to forecast the integration between China and Africa using a wavelet ARIMA hybrid. This is more of an econometric application to this area. So what is it? What we found out from the first paper is that China's economic engagement with Africa strongly focuses on trade. And this trade is predominantly export of natural resources out from Africa to China, and the imports of finished products from China to Africa. And these products, in most cases, they are low quality products. We had a clear indication that Africa is now regarded as a dumping site. So, but these trade flows, looking on the demand side, Africa exports, we need them. We need that money. Yeah, we need that money for capital to invest in other projects. So trade flows generally are considered as an important economic integration indicator between economies. And international economic integration is vital for growth and development of developing countries in particular, because it facilitates the transfer of capital, transfer of technology, and the transfer of knowledge. So here we argue that the accurate forecasting of trade flows evolution as an economic integration indicator is crucial for planning and policy development purposes. For China, Africa in particular, economic integration between the two economies can serve as a piece of quantitative evidence to inform decision on the prevailing uncertainties about the future of these relationships. So in econometrics, mostly one of the classical methods that we use to forecast is ARIMA model, but you'll find that ARIMA is mostly subject to the sample size, and the evidence that is there shows that if your variables are less than, if your observations are less than 65, you're likely to get spurious regression. So that's why we had to combine ARIMA and the wavelet approach just to try and account for that weakness. And we'll see that that weakness manifests, in fact, in our results. So that's the reason why we use ARIMA in general. The features that are there in the wavelet, ARIMA hybrid, they actually help us to improve the forecasting accuracy in this Africa's economic integration. For this study in particular, data, quantitative data of Chinese flows to Africa, they are still scarce. To the best of my knowledge, the long data that is available stretches from 1992 up to 2020. which is being compiled by China Africa Research Initiative, John Hopkins University. Then Aid and Data, Mary and Williams, they deal most with the number of projects, the value of projects, which is quite relevant when somebody is doing spatial regression. Right, here are the findings of the ARIMA, and it actually reflects the weakness of ARIMA because our data is quite small from 1992 to 2019. I'm sure that's 28 observations, which is less than the recommended length of the sample. So we find that as Fig 1 shows, it shows a white nose 9 seasonal ARIMA model, implying that the integration indicator had no clear trend between this period and therefore cannot be predicted. So we cannot depend on ARIMA alone. But with the hybrid of wavelet and ARIMA, we were able to predict the integration between China and Africa using the export growth. Africa export growth to China is a percentage. And what we found out is that from 2019 to 2020, it is likely that export growth to China will increase by 21.71%, then 16.02% in 2021, 21.93 in 2022, 21.85 in 2023, and 6.9 in 2024. All right, some might say we are already in 22. Why is this estimation? Like what I said, that's when I conducted this study, the data that was available, it stretched from 1992 up to 2019. But I checked sometime 2 weeks ago, they've updated it to 2020. So it means we still have no data for 2021, 2022 up to. So these are the forecast. So using this forecast, we derived that 2020 exports to China will increase to 95.77 billion. To these figures, 111 billion, 135 billion in 2022, 165 billion in 2023, and 176 billion in 2024. What does this tell us then? If you look from the period 1992 to 2019, like what we saw on my first presentation, 84% of Africa's exports to China come from 10 resource-rich countries, with 36% concentrated in Angola. As we can see here, 36% of all these exports are concentrated in Angola, 13% in South Africa. So close to 50%, almost 50% of Chinese exports of Africa's exports to China, they come from only 2 countries, Angola and South Africa. Yes. So as highlighted in various studies, this is an indication that Africa's export volumes to China are dominated by natural resources. And these exports are propelled by Chinese increasing demand for raw materials to supply its booming manufacturing industry. We also did a robustness check to just check, yes, and we found that our findings are robust. Then sources of Chinese imports from Africa. Number 1, resource-seeking Chinese investment in Africa. So all FDI that comes from Africa, like we saw before, it comes straight to the mining industry. Then the same Chinese companies that are mining in Africa, they are the ones that will export those mining proceeds back to China. That's number 1 source. Number 2, natural resource-backed loans, like what we saw happening in Angola. It also happened in Zambia, natural resource-backed loans in which default repayments are made through the extraction of natural resource. So they That's why you see that China doesn't look much on the institutional quality of the African countries if they are borrowing the African countries. They don't look much on that. Angola, for example, it has worst institutions in Africa, high corruption, rule of law is poor, but that's where we find a large portion of the Chinese loans going. Why? They're natural resource backed. So there's no risk there. They know that if they default payment, they'll just take oil back to China. Simple as that. Then number 3, China is exchanging its loans meant for infrastructure development in Africa, natural resources. All these loans. It happened, a case, a very good example is Zambia, for that road, which I was actually talking about. Much of it was backed with copper. Then the issue that, in fact, Zambia is the largest recipient of Chinese loans meant to support government expenses, paying of civil servant salaries, which is actually a poor investment. So what? The predictions given in Fig 2 in our results for the forecasting are not surprising, as China is expected to continue exploiting natural resources from Africa, as long as its factories are still operational and growing. As long as they have appetite to grow their their manufacturing industry, Africa will always be the target and they'll continue to exploit. However, there is room for improvement in both export flows and decisive outcome, especially in favor of Africa. Number 1, if China and Africa natural resource exchange deals can be properly valued in line of the world market commodities price. Number 2, if Africa improves its participation in this integration. Meanwhile, what other studies suggest is that most of China-Africa natural resource exchanges are undervalued relative to the international market. And the other thing is that Africa has remained reluctant towards Chinese exploitative attitude. So the other thing is that negative deviations from the projections that we provided can be actually attributed, in particular in 2020, can be attributed to COVID-19 pandemic, which slammed trade and other economic activities along the world. This is our conclusion on this paper. The increase of Africa's export flows to China is primarily driven by Chinese appetite for natural resources to supply its booming manufacturing industry. Thus, this can be a win-win cooperation, but only and only if African countries improve their bargaining position in the trade and other financial arrangements with Africa. My case has always been, in as much as China is availing itself with capital, we are the receiving end, and we should make sure that capital is utilized effectively and with reasonable payment conditions. So it always comes back to us to say, are we being responsible of what is being put on the table? So to me, there is a possibility of a win-win cooperation, but we have to up our bargaining position. We have to up our institutions. Thank you so much.
Okay, the next presentation is by Wilson. And we'll have.
No, I have to.
Wilson, you have 15 minutes.
Yeah, it should be in the flash. Did you move it? No. Okay, still in the flash. Okay. That's it. I'm there. I'm there. Okay, perfect. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Nice seeing your beautiful faces again today. My name is Vincent Wede, and this paper is about Sino-Africa trade. When we say Sino-Africa trade, we're actually making reference to China-Africa trade and China-African aid, sorry. And there's a keyword there, architecture. And another one, workforce localization. With this paper, we are trying to see, or we try to see and establish empirical argument with respect to what China's aid architecture look like. How does it differ from international aid architecture? And how does that impact on workforce localization? We know for sure that there's been evidence, empirical evidence about the growth impact of China's aid. The last speaker, Dr. Marvelous, emphasized on how China's aid has increased over the years and how it has impacted on the output from African countries. But our worry is, even with the growth, can we say that the growth is inclusive? While growth is good, growth must be inclusive for it to be more embracing. And that is what this paper is trying to look at. We know how important unemployment or employment is in the development process of every nation. Unemployment is a very important macroeconomic indicator. When we talk about the misery index, you know for sure that in the computation of the misery index, unemployment and inflation are combined to compute the misery index. High rate of unemployment implies that there will be high level of misery index. And by virtue of that, the economic well-being of Africans as a nation and individuals who are domiciled or who are residents, who are nationals of Africa, will continue to increase. Now, let us look at it from this perspective. The aid architecture, as it is a very important factor that determines to what extent aid can be effective. Aid effectiveness is a discourse, an economic, political, economic, historical discourse that has been exhausted to some certain degree. But the question is, how does aid architecture affect the effectiveness of aid? There is an argument between the Washington Consensus architecture and the Beijing model architecture. When we talk about the Beijing model architecture, we're actually making reference to the Chinese architecture, aid architecture. And the argument is that what makes aid, what constitutes aid from the perspective of the Washington Consensus aid architecture and the Sino-Africa aid architecture. The slide you have there tells us that there are four areas of aid architecture: the institutions and actors, volumes and composition, the instruments and modalities, the rules and the standards. Now, can we say Chinese aid architecture matches or fits fully into what the international aid architecture implies? The answer is no. China has its own definition of aid. Why the OECD DAC comes up with definition of aid ranging from support programs to human capital development and the rest. China's definition of aid is strictly infrastructural development. And you agree with me that this is very strategic. Strategic in the sense that it tends to foster or support China's interest in Africa. China is interested in Africa, not because China loves Africa, not because China wants Africa to develop. China loves Africa because of what they can get from Africa. And when they provide aid to improve infrastructural development, they are only doing that because it will aid trade between them and Africa. And that is exactly where the problem lies. Now, let us go straight, since we don't have much time, let's go straight to how China's aid architecture affects workforce localization. Now, you agree with me also that if China comes to Africa, China has come to Africa, obviously. China has been around for a long time. It will not be unexpected to see China importing not only their capital, but also their domestic policies. In China has a very interesting, I call it interesting because it is very useful to this work. The labor policy in China is very stiff. In China, you're not allowed to join trade union of your choice. It has to be the state's crafted, implemented, and designed state union that is in charge. And by virtue of that, China has transferred that same policy at home here to Africa. And that is a very important factor that is affecting us in one way or the other. But let us provide some empirical evidence to what we've been saying. The figures will show us how and to what extent China's aid architecture has impacted on workforce localization. Mind you, when we talk about workforce localization, it simply means the extent to which jobs that are being handled by foreign expatriates, that is by Chinese expatriates, have been taken over by local or people from that same country or the continent that is Africa. So now the question is, how has China's aid helped to foster low level of workforce localization? And we're going to look at some data. Before we go ahead, I have to acknowledge the fact that, just like the last speaker mentioned, data from China as regard the composition of aid and the aid architecture, to say the least, is very, very limited. Unlike when you deal with the OEC, the DACs, when you go to the credit reporting system site, you see detailed analysis of aid, well coordinated. But for China, the story is different. And so we are limited by data. So I'll at this point apologize or seek your understanding that some of the data may not really tell a full story of what this paper is trying to present, but we will try as much as possible to make sense out of the data. So let us go to what we have. Now we want to look at Chinese aid, or the one we called Sino-African aid architecture. The first is institutions and actors. Under institutions and actors, it is obvious that first, let us look at the composition. The composition tells us that 83% of China's development assistance, let's use that word, China's development assistance to Africa is made up of loans, the total, while only 17% constitute foreign aid. We couldn't go further with the foreign aid component because it is just it is a total. It is what I got from the website is an aggregate. And so the implication why we are doing this first, why we're showing you this, is to first establish the fact that our emphasis will be more on the loans and not on the foreign aid, because one, the foreign aid constitutes just 17% of the total, and two, we have issues with data. So we're going to continue our analysis using the loan component of the total development assistance from China. So we'll go to the next slide. The next slide shows us that the institutions and actors that makes up or that are responsible for the aid or loan received by Africa are the Exim Bank, Chinese Exim Bank, the CDB, that's the Chinese Development Bank, and other Chinese institutions, contractors, and also when we talk about the deposit money banks in China. And you see that the Exim Bank is the main actor, is the main institution. So what this means is the aid coming from China is mainly from the Chinese Exim Bank. That is one as regard the institutions. Now, if you look at the values and compositions, the previous speaker spoke about it, Angola. In this case, we are going to make reference to two concepts or two words, if I will use that, darling and orphans. In aid, we talk about aid darlings and aid orphans. From this table, it is obvious that Angola is the most darling country to China when it comes to loan, while Central African Republic is the worst orphan when it comes to loan from China to Africa. From what we have here, China, CAR, that's Central African Republic, occupies the 48th position. And so if you look at it critically, you see that there is a trend. There's a trend about the values. Look at it, you see that most of the countries that makes up the top 10 countries, just like the last speakers mentioned, are resource-rich countries. Look at them from Angola. You can see Nigeria there. You can see South Africa there. You can see Egypt there. These are resource-rich countries, and evidence abounds that these countries account for a larger percentage of natural resources in Africa. If we go further to the next slide, we also look at values and composition from the sectors that received more loans. It is also obvious from the slide you have there that transport, power, and mining are the three key sectors that received more than 70% of the loan from China to Africa. Again, this is strategic. It is aimed at driving China's interest in Africa, which is increased in growth, in trade. They want our natural resources. They want a situation whereby they can easily navigate from Africa to Asia using the OBR initiative, the one we called One Belt, One Road initiative. And that is what the values and the compositions area of the aid architecture has shown us. Now we'll look at the instruments and modalities. The instruments. From our study, we're able to show, or we're able to discover that the Exim Bank uses mostly natural resource-based loan and line of credit, and the preferential export bias credit. What are we saying? Just like the last speaker mentioned, Chinese loan are aimed at tapping the natural resources that we have. So when you want to take the loan, they want an agreement that says, we are tying this loan to your natural resources. If it is crude oil, we're tying it to crude oil. If it is copper, we're tying it to copper. And that is the reason why the instrument and modalities aspect of Chinese loan to Africa or Chinese aid architecture is mainly natural resource-backed loans and lines of credit and preferential export bias credit. You already know that Chinese trade with Africa has been growing. And as such, this is another instrument that is used by China. Now for the modalities, Chinese definition of aid accounted for the modalities with which aid is delivered. For the rules and standard, we said it earlier on, that there is the Washington Consensus Aid Architecture, and there is also the Beijing Model Aid Architecture. The Beijing Model is what dictates or what tells exactly the rules and standards guiding Chinese aid or Chinese loan to Africa. Now, let us look at very important aspect, Now we're coming home to the issue of Chinese aid or China aid architecture and workforce localization. The slide you have there tells you that we have two sections of that table. We have the table showing the top 10 borrowers of Chinese loan. We have discussed that before. And we also have the other section talking about the countries accounting for the annual average number of Chinese workers in Africa. Algeria is there. Mind you, from the other section, Algeria isn't even one of those countries that we can refer to as an aid darling to China. But Algeria accounts for the highest. But after Algeria, we have the darling Angola, the main bride of the Chinese government, the Angolan government. Look at them accounting for an average of 37,608 Chinese workers every year, an average. That's between the period of 2009 and 2018. That's what we have here. If you now go further, you will see that there is obviously some consistent trend between Chinese workers and Chinese loan. Look at it, you see that the moment the Chinese loan is dropping at a particular time, you can see that the number of workers will also do what? Will also drop. Meaning that the mechanism employed by China in executing projects in Africa is not just because they want to do it and they allow Africans to contribute or to benefit from it. They also come with their own workforce. And when they do that, it means that local people do not have access to work. And by virtue of that, localization of the workforce will gradually diminish. Now, we also have a table here. We went further, besides the trend analysis we did, we went further to do some econometric analysis. We conducted some pre-estimation diagnostic tests. Obviously, what we did, we have two panel unit root test results that we have there, and it is obvious that all the longitudinal data series that we have, we're all fine. If you look at the results there. Now, we try to see if we can also do some econometric analysis, trying to establish the relationship between Chinese loan and Chinese workers, and between Chinese workers and the employment growth rate in African countries. Now, the first one shows that, yes, Chinese loan grandeur causes number of Chinese workers. We already showed it in the diagram. This is an empirical evidence to show. We also proved that number of Chinese workers also have an impact on employment growth. And it is also there on the slide. With that, we concluded by saying that Chinese aid architecture, though not completely and entirely different from the international aid architecture, there are clear-cut differences. Though not completely different, there are clear-cut differences. And for that reason, the way it works is quite different from the way the international aid architecture works. China is not interested in the development of Africa. Sad to say, but they are more interested in what they are going to get. They don't want to see, they are not interested in social issues. And we know quite all right that the institutions, the institutions are key elements to the development of every country. Even if you have all the resources, but your institutions are terrible, then it is obvious that you can't go anywhere. But China is not interested. China doesn't want to know if there's a high level of corruption in your country. They just want to know, do you need the loan? Okay, you have natural resources, you will give us. Oh, we can export from you, do this. That's the only thing China is interested in. And it is embedded in the Beijing model. Because for the Beijing model, every country to your own. manage your development process. China has insisted that unlike what is obtainable in the Washington Consensus, they are not interested in interfering with what happens in your country. They are more interested in the business relationship you have with them. And it has impacted on workforce localization. And it is something we need to look at critically. But now the question is, can we really say that the problem of the impact of China's aid architecture on workforce localization is entirely China's problem? This is the point where we need to come back home as African countries. We should ask ourselves, what effort are we making to design and implement policies that will insist on workforce localization? We keep going to China, begging. We have no policies placed before them. We no longer, we do not insist that, oh, if you have to come to our country, we keep looking at it as if we are the only ones benefiting from Chinese loan, without looking at it from the other perspective. And that is why this workshop that tries to explain to us that we have two competitors competing for Africa's resources and Africa's population. We have China, we have India. Have we looked at India? One of the speakers yesterday made mention, I think it's Professor Anand Singh, who mentioned the beauty of Chinese approach to labor policy. That India's approach to labor policy, that the Indians are more tolerant, they are more receptive, their policies are more friendly when it comes to their relationship with laborers. That is, by the way, this work did not bother to look at that. So we cannot say for a certainty if that is the case, because we don't have any empirical evidence. But the point is, we should begin to look at other sources of funding, like India, for example. Again, we need to look at it from another perspective, the perspective of our attitude towards policies. If you look at the slide you have there, we see that countries are categorized, the labor policies are categorized based on their strictness, from their strictness to their more free level of what I call a very unserious level of labor policy. But look at it again. Having a policy is good. Insisting on implementing the policy is another one. If you look at that slide, you see that Angola has a strict labor policy on paper. Angola has a strict labor policy on paper. But when it comes to Chinese loan, it cannot implement. Rather, anybody can come. As long as you're getting the loan, bring the workers. And the workers are coming. So that means our attitude towards these aid donors, in this case, China, also makes it easier for China to go about their business the way they want to. So we have to insist. We have to begin to implement policies, not just designing them, or implementing them to the latter, so that we benefit from Chinese rule in Africa. Thank you very much.
We have these two good papers. We can have a few questions now. We want to finish this presentation by 12 and 1 hour to our questions. So that issues that we have developed from this. So thank you very much. And now I will take some questions.
I don't think we need this because I don't Thank you very much.
Okay, okay.
Lecturer's voice hard enough. It's going to be too long. Mrs. Thank you very much for making some recommendations in terms of policies, etc. that need to be. I want to ask, what is the alternative in terms of trading with China? Our consumers in South Africa are exporting food. They go for the cheapest food. You can see that, and that happens in the textile industry. The textile, South Africa's strong textile industry was killed the moment that we took away the tariffs and the cheaper things go. That's it. We don't, we are poor, low income people, and people don't tend to buy the biggest. Now we sit with the situation that we need to trade with someone. We sit with, otherwise we have a trade deficit, and that is just going up. We are resource rich, yes. I totally buy into the concept of resource curse. And I think that is what we have. For years and years and years, we were so comfortable with just, whenever there's a problem, we buy more gold. You sell more diamonds, you sell gold, and you solve all the problems. And we didn't do anything. So if you look at international trade, you have to export something that you produce. One at a time, this resource rich country will become a resource poor country, and then no one even would want to give us a loan, even if they could bring their own people. So my problem is that we are speaking around the problem all the time. We're just analyzing the information as it is read, but we don't come and we're not honest enough with ourselves to say, yes, we see all of this, we can prove all of this, we can prove that China is just exploiting us. Why? Because our productivity is too low. That's why we are there's not enough education, we don't have enough technology. But our productivity compared to our wages is just not in line with what it is supposed to be. Therefore, we cannot take any of it. We cannot produce something that is compatible with the rest of the world because it is too expensive. The rest of the world similarly that with their thing and that with their purses. So I'm just a little bit, we can sit and we do the same arguments over and over, and China is the bad guy, and China is taking our resources, and China is not good for us, and China is making the rules. If I go to a bank for a loan and I want to buy a new car, I cannot negotiate. I look at my salary and they say, you can just get this much. Take it or leave it. Now, if I want to buy a car, and I desperately want to buy a car, even if I don't like it, and I can moan and complain afterwards as much as I want to, I will have to take the loan under their circumstances. So, yes, we can negotiate better. We can have policies better in terms of quality control better. But there's not a lot that we can do to prevent people to do this because we need the money. They will all be destroyed because we need the money. But here's the professor right in front of you.
Thanks. Yeah, I suppose I have comments, but I both agree and disagree with you. Yeah, you did say to the speakers that we're talking around the problem, and I don't think that you are any less guilty of that, because what is the problem? If we are importing 80% of food that we eat, and we have the sunshine and land and space available for it, why can't we do what the Chinese are already doing? If you go to China, every possible space that you see in China actually has a hothouse that's growing food. That's what's making them major exporters of food. That's what you see in India as well. every possible space that you have, however small the land is, you produce on your own. But the Chinese became victims of their own greed and also their own lack of vision in 2008 when the economic financial crash took place. Because their economy was so export oriented to the point where when that crash happened in the New York Stock Exchange and everybody else in the world also fell victim to that, the Chinese couldn't even buy train tickets back home. They had 6 to 12 months waiting list to move from one province to the next because so many of those factories actually closed down. Now, they recovered very fast. And I will come to another quick point. I don't want to hold the floor, but it's very important and it's something that I have a passion for. Both you guys have actually spoken of something that is very close to my heart right now. That is especially because my paper got accepted in a good journal and resonates with a lot of what both you guys are saying. You know, over the last decade, China used more than 100 million tons of concrete and tar to construct their roads. And if you look at the Chinese network of bridges and roads, they are just so admirable that we have a long way in anybody in this country or to actually catch up with it. Yet the roads that the Chinese are building in Africa are collapsing. They built an $8 billion hospital in Angola, and it collapsed after 3 months. To the point where they had to actually have an open air hospital because they couldn't help it. Then they built their own Mozambique, which connected them to Botswana, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. That road collapsed. How is it that Chinese are actually building such solid roads, so attractively built as well? But when they come into Africa, they're building roads that are collapsing. They're putting in hospitals that are collapsing. That they now really have to point towards the leadership that we have in this country. And that's what I think Professor Kennedy is lacking in her comment. No, when Professor Sudhar spoke about 1 rand 50 cents coming into the Senate and 3 rand less is coming into the Senate, what is it that is actually wrong? Is it true? I mean, there's container loads of clothes coming, and shoes and the rest of it coming from China. Now, how is it that at our customs, something like that is actually happening, where other clothes are really produced, and I don't believe this for one moment, that China is producing a pant for 1 rand and making 50 cents. Or they're producing a dress for 2 rands and making 1 rand by selling it for 3 rands. Is there something wrong at our customs that side? And who is it that's actually responsible? I am not pointing fingers at politicians. But just one last point, and that is Augustino Neto and Dos Santos and Golden Wheels. Do you know that they actually got $3 for every barrel of oil that they sold on the New York Stock Exchange? And Angola sells an average of 80,000 barrels a day. And what was Dos Santos making at that time? He was making, if you got 80,000 barrels of oil per day, and you are being paid $3 per barrel, the man was earning $240,000 per day, but he was spending most of his time in Brazil. As you know, Angola and Brazil are both Portuguese dominated, right? So, if the leadership in Africa is actually going to behave like that and continue to depend upon the outside instead of turning inward and engaging in what we would call endogenously based development, as opposed to exogenous development, then you're going to continue to owe people money. So,
yeah, most of that we will probably again do. We discussed in the last hour, that I really appreciate what Dr. Ramos and Vincent brought these two important issues, really good research. We really appreciate. Thank you, round of applause. question is no question. There. So, any more question? Okay, yeah, we can have early tea and come back early. I want to finish all by 12 and then 1 hour of discussion. Thank you. Okay, there is also an announcement. Was told that package will go by 11. So keep your stuff in your car or. Okay, why not we have a clean up and then come early and then we'll start.
Over that. Something I did. Have we stopped? Stop the recording. Wait.
Oh, yeah.
I want to check something.
Mute.
Understand? I don't know where this is.
There's a folder on the desktop.
Okay. Okay.
Good morning, delegates. My paper is on China's growing economic cloud. In Africa, I'm looking at the economic and political impacts. So a brief introduction to this topic. I'll be looking at the historical development of Chinese-African trade. And the historical context briefly is that China had long-standing trade relations with the African continent starting from 1500. But after 2000, this interest started growing deeply and trade started increasing rapidly because of the new democratic era in China and Africa respectively. And within a decade, China became the second largest trading partner of Africa and provided loans and international aid too. The interesting question was that this was met with skepticism from the United States and European Union powers who felt threatened because they felt that if China started providing loans, then their status will be under threat. And this is because of the changing geopolitical and socio-political role of China as a growing power. So what I'm trying to say is that China providing aid and investment to Africa should be viewed with great caution because it has certain political implications and ramifications. Continuing on with the historical development, since the 1980s when the liberalization occurred, as we all know from the late 1980s, communism started ending and weakening, and China became more started liberalizing its economy. So it started to look towards Africa as a source of trade. And China then developed a significant trade surplus with Africa, and African countries were having huge deficits, which means it's an unequal relationship and China is benefiting from this relationship. So the point is that China is actually benefiting because it's gaining access to to African resources, and Africa is not really benefiting because not much skills development is taking place. So this brings a new debate on neo-colonialism and how China is dominating Africa, and the Sino-domination of Africa is occurring, which is killing indigenous African industries. And this is similar to colonialism, and it's trying to promote Chinese hegemony. Now, brief statistics is given here. Trade has grown from $6 billion in 1990 to $780 billion 19 years later in 2009. And this is according to the World Bank report in 2006. So now I'll be looking at the nature of the trade. As previously stated, the trade relationship is highly unequal and is favorably skewed towards China, and the economic data supports this. So China is starting to export goods that are cheap, and this is flooding the African continent, or it's known as dumping, and it has a negative impact on the local industries, and it leads to depression, economic depression. The typical industries include the textile industry, the fishing industries, the clothing and leather industry, North Africa, and so on. And because of these cheap influx of Chinese goods, Africa is unable to produce similar goods because of they can't compete with them on the basis of price. The cost of producing the African goods are too high, and the labor is also quite expensive. So small Chinese traders have flocked to Africa that are competing head-to-head with their African counterparts. And that has led to growing antagonism with the African market traders, although consumers are welcoming the competition. So consumers are happy to have these Chinese traders because they're offering goods at cheaper prices, but the South African businesses or African businesses are not. The interesting thing to note is that African governments welcome the Chinese loans quite a bit, but there are signs that these loans are contributing to a debt problem, and it's leading to unnecessary economic stress. I'll be now combining the economic and political impacts under one section. And economically, there are three main schools of thought that describe these impacts. The first school of thought is basically anti-Chinese and pro-Western school of thought, which is saying that this relationship is based on the development of a neo-colonial economic relationship where China is a dominant partner and Africa is its slave or subservient party. And the point of this school of thought is trying to achieve the Chinese Communist Party's long-term strategic objective of becoming the world's most powerful economy and dictating its terms to the world. So to create a new socialist order which challenges the American capitalist system. The second school of thought is about the debilitating role of the economic aid and how harmful this aid is for Africa. And China is using aid as a way to garner support on its political issues, such as Hong Kong and other Taiwan and so on. And this is propounded or espoused by American and other Western nations. And meanwhile, the third school of thought is the African view, where Chinese operations and aid are seen as rather favorable. And this is supported by the African heads of states and other political commentators. So a brief historical context of how this economic aid and trade came about is after the 1970s, when Chinese economic relations with Africa strengthened and started growing. It was driven by ideological imperatives. Well, what I mean by ideological imperatives is that China started viewing itself as a global power, challenging American interests after it saw the Soviet Union trying to challenge the Americans. So China decided that it's going to be the main spouser of Marxism and Leninism. And this was used as a way to achieve economic colonialism and sometimes even cultural colonialism as well. And Chinese companies started entering African markets. Today, there are 1,000 Chinese companies operating in Africa. 1 million people of Chinese descent are settled here. And the trade has grown substantially, especially after 2005, where it has grown to 113 billion in 2019. And over the past 16 years, this has been steadily increasing. What has led to the increase in this trade is the economic liberalization of China, but it ebbed a little bit in 2014 and 17 when the exports to China from Africa increase while when the exports from Africa to China increase, while Chinese exports to Africa remain steady, means they did not increase or decrease that much. As you can see from this figure, in 2000, the orange is the imports, the yellow is the exports. It wasn't much of a difference. It was roughly the same 20 years ago. In 2005, the exports started increasing, and this continued on in 2010. It dropped in 2015, and in 2018, it rose again. So now I'll be discussing the political impacts. And this table over here basically compares the conquest of Africa to the scramble for Africa in the 20th century, where China is trying to control Africa politically and economically. And the heading on the left says the scramble for Africa in the 20th century has led to many people this. It's changing Africa's political structure and sovereignty, and the effect of this on the relationship between Africa and China. It has created a tense atmosphere on the continent, means that there's a constant ideological war between China and the US on who is the actual master and who maintains or controls the hegemony and so on. The second point, it has led to a weakening of African democracy. That's the second political impact, and the belief in Western democracy is getting diminished daily. The effect of this is the tension is created between Africa and America, marked by intense ideological and geopolitical risk, which means there's constant political instability on the continent, and there's a risk of coups and so on. The third point, or third impact, is a new era of Chinese colonialism has emerged, where Africa has been used as a political pawn for Chinese interests. Once again, the effect of it is where China's trying to be seen to challenge the American supremacy in the way of life. A new world order is trying to be created. And lastly, Africa is being exploited, and it is hoped that Africa will support China on Chinese issues and take its stance. So here it's just a continuation of the master-servant relationship, where China is trying to be the new colonial power and Africa its colony, and the colonial model or legacy is being promoted and carried on. So now, the political impacts are quite ambivalent. Some of the African leaders are quite positive about China's economic and political influence. About 63% of African leaders consider it to be positive. That this is according to a 2016 poll conducted by Afrobarometer, conducted in 36 countries. However, some of the African leaders are wary of the increasing Chinese investment and are questioning the motives, as illustrated by this quote. There's a lot of controversy going on about China's presence in Africa. Some countries have pushed back against China's development activities, and a lot of grievances such as the poor compliance with safety and environmental standards, unethical business practices, and the violations of local laws. I think a lot of African heads of state and labor unions feel that Chinese businesses are flagrantly violating the local laws and encouraging unethical practices, corruption in the tender processes and business acquisitions. And this is seen to be one of the drawbacks for why China shouldn't be investing on the continent. So this has led to the impression that China has exploited the resources without building up local economies, and this has triggered fierce criticism from some leaders. About a decade ago, Michael Sata, the Zambian president, used this effectively by tapping into the anti-Chinese sentiment and tried to create a platform to boycott China. And this was supported by the Nigerian governor, the Nigerian central bank governor, who said that China is a competitor and a threat to Africa. And it's not a benevolent partner. And he advocated that the US and Britain and Brazil are far better than the Chinese. So the conclusion I made is the presentation is looking at the growing trade between China and Africa from a historical perspective, and these relations are highly asymmetrical and unequal in favor of China, and it's a colonial type of relationship. It's also unprecedented in the sense as there's a challenge to the American world order and a new ideological front can be created that is worrying the America and the West. And Africa needs to be wary of relying too much on Chinese aid and investments and hope to keep its independence. This is a difficult thing to do. And that's any questions? Okay.
Very much, Dr. Tiwari, for that wonderful presentation. We'll now move on to the second presenter, that's Dr. Okoli. Can you make him promote him to the panelists? Okoli. Yes, sir. I would like to say for those of us online, if you have questions, Okoli, Tochukwu Okoli. So you can type it in the chat box so that we can take it while we're taking the questions. But since they cannot, yeah, there's no audio. There's no audio. I saw a chat here.
Okay, I'm going to indicate the service. Can you go back to the panelist and then allow him to speak? No, he's still there. Okay, switch him to. No, speak his presentation. Allow him to this. Who's the left speaker?
It's already there.
Dorothy.
Oh, okay. And then, hello, which one? Yeah, he can unmute himself. Yeah, tell him to unmute himself. The sound is sorted.
Hello, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
You can share your screen now.
All right.
No, you will say this. No, because of the video. Oh, when you see.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me and you can see my screen.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. All protocol duly observed. I'm Dr. Koli Tochku Timothy, and I'm here to present on the topic African Continental Free Trade Area, its implications for India and China. These are the outline of my presentation. I'll go through the background of the study, then I will go through the objectives of my study. I will take the history and the formation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Then I'll review some important conceptual issues in the topic in the study, and then I'll look at various theories that has been propounded by different scholars on how to measure economic integration. And then I'll probably look at the benefits that AFCFTA, that is African Continental Free Trade Area, can give to Africa and, of course, the global economy. And then I will consider also the challenges with this integration. Then particularly, I'll look at the implications of this integration to India and China. And then I'll consider also I'll look at the conclusion from the study and then the policy recommendations. Okay. Before now, over the years, African economies have been the world's most biodiverse regions. Africa is well blessed in different kinds of resources, and the global world is beginning to tap into these benefits from Africa. In fact, about 50% of the total wealth of African countries comes from the exportation of biodiverse resources. This has created markets not only for African economies, but also for other regions of the world. These are the reasons many developed world is coming to Africa to, buy their raw materials and then process it, and of course take it back to Africa, and most often than not sell it at a higher price than what they bought the resources. So Africans over the years are beginning to, look at how to harness trade among themselves so that the benefits of trade can be maximally achieved among themselves, and of course extend these benefits to the rest of the world. So African economies has been looking at ways to get maximum benefits from its own trade and hence develop its own economies. Now, trade among African economies leads to two kinds of effects. First, it leads to trade creation, and then secondly, trade diversion. Due to the wealth of resources that Africans are blessed with, many countries outside Africa are coming to form a kind of an integration for trade benefits between Africa, thereby creating trade between Africa and the rest of the world. But then recently, Africans are beginning to, come together and form different unions or different regional communities to harness these benefits among themselves, thereby leading to trade diversion from the Western world down to Africa. And this led to the birth of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Actually, the formation of this integration, this economic integration, dates back from the time of that African economies are beginning to gain their independence, 1950, 1960s, with the OAU being formed in 1963. One of the propositions of this union is to have a kind of unity and, of course, trade benefits among themselves. So after the African Organization of African Unity we are inaugurated, that was in 1963, there were different moves towards incorporating different benefits of trade so that African economy as a whole will have its own economic trade union that will integrate the rest of the African world. So these are the 5 different stages that this African Continental Free Trade Area took before it came to being. The first is the OAU Charter, that was in 1963, where different African countries come together and then they formed this union, basically for economic unity, but then as an extension, they equally wanted trade benefits among themselves. And then the next I will look at is the Lagos Plan of Action, where emphasis was laid on industrializing Africa, and of course, making Africa to be self-reliant. And then the Abuja Treaty, and then I look at the Biet decision, that is boosting intra-African trade. And then finally, the agreement being established finally in 2018. Now, when you look at this diagram, that gives a kind of a summary of the formation stages of the African Continental Free Trade Area. First is the OAU Charter, which aimed to have a kind of a political declaration and resolution. Then they moved towards a kind of a small-scale integration and experiment among themselves. Now, this union equally leads to 3 other different agreements being signed. First, the Lagos Plan of Action in 1980, which fosters the integration of the continent and, of course, promotes self-reliance of African economy, and then the industrialization of African economy. About a decade later, the Abuja Treaty was signed among different African economies. And the basic postulations in this Abuja Treaties is to promote regional integration, establish a free trade area among different African economies. Among these regional economic integrations are the East African agreements, and then we also have other unions like the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, and then there are many of them. So as we go on, I will show you. Then the next is the Biet decision. That is boosting intra-African trade. That was actually signed in 2012 by about 22 African markets. It was actually a conference that gave birth to this decision. Now, the major tenets of this decision is to the rationalization or rationalizing African economic integration, preservation of the regional economic communities, and finally, a kind of a sub-regional union being formed by different African markets. Now about 3 economic unions came together to form this to form a free trade area that sets the pace for the formation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. One of them is the Eastern African Community, and then secondly is the Common Market for Africa and for East and Southern Africa, and then also there's another one that is the Southern African Development Community. 3 of them came together and then formed a union among themselves that actually sets the pace for African economic integration. So about 15 years later, the agreement was eventually signed by about 22 member nations in Africa. The main purpose of this signing was actually to form a trade integration that is second to the largest, that is second to the World Trade Organization, which has a member of about 160 countries. So this is the second largest free trade area in the world, comprising 54 African countries. Is just one of the countries in Africa that is yet to sign this treaty. But That notwithstanding, some African countries were not so fast in signing this treaty due to some reasons, which we are going to see when I come to the challenges of African Continental Free Trade Area. Okay, now I go to the basic concepts and that are used in this study. First, economic integration, which I've already somehow explained while I was, discussing the formation stages of African Continental Free Trade Area. Actually, basically, economic integration is the uniting of two or more national economies into a regional trading agreement. This regional trading agreement, sometimes they have the agreement to have a kind of an economic or financial convergence among these integrating states. Economic integration is a process of eliminating trade restrictions on international trade, removing restrictions on payments and factor mobility. So this is part of what the AFCON is actually looking at, to have a free trade agreements among themselves, and that trade will be, that member states can freely trade among themselves in different member states nations. Okay, the next is the regional economic communities. This was part of the Abuja Treaties that was signed in 1991 by different African countries. The aim is actually to encourage African economies to have different regional economic communities among themselves, and that led to the formation of ECOWAS and common market for Eastern and Southern Africa and the rest that I mentioned before now. So different regional economics were formed, but then being so independent among themselves, there were certain restrictions that were still meted on different African economies that are not member of a particular economic region. So there was a forward-looking agreements kind of a thing to see how to bring these different economic integration, economic communities into one single entities, which eventually led to the formation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And when I talk about the free trade area, it's simply a suppression of different trade restrictions and giving member states the liberty to trade among themselves, removing things like tariff barriers or import quota barriers, or free movement barriers and stuff like that. So that was actually what the afterset is actually looking at. Now, I spoke about different economic communities coming together to form one entity, which is called a tripartite free trade agreement. Basically, it is the regional economic communities comprising of the South African Development Community, East African Community, and then the common markets for Eastern and Southern Africa. They actually came together and signed this agreement in June 2011, so that this agreement was actually signed in Johannesburg, South Africa, to have free trade among their member states. Then the next concepts I reviewed in this work is the Continental Free Trade Area. It is a proposed plan of economic cooperation among African countries. The idea behind the Continental Free Trade Agreement was first proposed in January 2012 in a paper titled Boosting Intra-African Trade, which is part of the formation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And it was agreed upon at the 18th Ordinary Section of the Assembly of the Head of States and Governments of the Organization of African Unity, held in Addis Ababa in 2012. Now, the theoretical views that this study looked at. First is the custom union theory as propounded by Jacob Wiener. That was in 1950. The maintenance of this theory includes the removal of trade barriers, tariff and non-tariff barriers, having a common external trade policy which initiates common external trade restrictions against non-members, but removes it among their own members. Free movement of goods and services, free movement of factors of production across nations and borders, harmonization of policies, unification of national monetary policies, and acceptance of common currency. A good example of such a union is the European Economic Union. So what this theory is basically saying is that for economic integration to work among the member states, they must not only have a trade agreement among themselves by removing trade barriers like tariff and non-tariff barriers, but they will also have a kind of an agreement on how to deal with non-member states. So that's the maintenance of this customs union theory. Then the next is the dynamic effects theory. This theory suggests that improved competition, investment flows, economics of scale, technology transfers, and enhanced productivity makes for a better economic integration. So what this theory, dynamic effect theory, is actually looking at is member states, aside from having a kind of a trade agreement among themselves, competition should as well encourage them to strive towards improving the status quo. That is moving towards a self-reliant economy that is self-dependent from the Western communities. Now, again, increased investment expenditure, increased demands, consolidation of production, and increased specialization, improvements of the organization and the management of production and all that. These are parts of what the dynamic effect theory is actually proposing, that economy should strive towards increasing investment and then increasing specialization and then increasing production among themselves, so as to avoid any risk of depending on foreign economies. Now, these are all the benefits that African continental free trade area among African countries gives to the member states. But as you can see them on the screen, the one I want to emphasize upon is the last one on this screen, which is how it will reduce poverty and then unite African countries together, and of course, how it can lead to a better allocation of resources and equally lead to faster economic development. This is the objective of the African continental free trade area. They drive towards coming to the point that African economies will be able to get to the point that they will not depend on the Western economy in terms of having sustainable growth that can promote its member states. So what I'm saying in essence is they look at how they can promote their own internal development so that African economy will not rely on the importation of equipments or expertise from the outside world to have its own to develop like the Western communities. So that is the surrounding the African continental free trade area. Of course, there are many other benefits, as you can see: consumer access to cheaper imported products from other African countries, increased business efficiencies through trade liberalization and removal of non-tariff barriers, greater economies of scale to producers, and access to cheaper raw materials among themselves, and of course, structural transformations among African economies. In fact, the benefits are enormous. It equally makes African economic to be resilient against some kind of like the COVID-19 outbreak. It will make African economic to be self-dependent on how to cushion these negative effects of such outbreak. Now, the challenges. Before the African Continental Free Trade Area was signed by 54 African economies, there were many African countries that delayed their membership of this regional economic integration. Notable among them is Nigeria. And part of the reasons for which they delayed their signing this agreement was that they are unsure of the benefits and, of course, their takes in the union. So many African countries, we are trying to avoid a situation where they will be economically dependent on other African countries. That actually delayed the signing of this agreement, and that formed one of the major problems surrounding the African Continental Free Trade Area. And so most African economies, we are not well developed, so they were being skeptical on not to hinder their own development pace by joining a union or an integration they are not too sure of. So the delay among many African countries, most African countries, in signing this agreement was actually the major challenges that African Continental Free Trade Area experienced. Another challenge is political instabilities in Africa. This is very pronounced, especially when it comes to African economies. Most African economies do not have an established structure for the transition of power such that government becomes a continuum. That is the subsequent government being able to continue with the policies and regulations of the past government. So when that becomes the case, it will actually limit the partnership that's and the agreements and the synergy that African countries gives to this union, and that can limit the benefits that most African countries can get among themselves. Now, there's poor communication and technology in the continent, and this equally forms a big problem. There's high rates of poverty in the country. And of course, another major challenge is that there are other mega regional trade agreements in the globe that works a kind of in parallel to this African Continental Free Trade Area. We are going to see it as I move on in this, so in this presentation. So what actually is the case here is that these mega regional trade agreements, a kind of shifts trade from Africa. Most of the African mega trade partners like India and China are beginning to refocus attention, move the attention from Africa to places like Europe and other Asian and American countries. So that becomes a problem to African, a big challenge to the continual existence of this African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, what are these implications? What challenges will the formation of the African Continental Free Trade Area pose to the major trading partners of Africa, which are India and China. First, it will provide opportunities for India and China firms and investors to tap into a larger, unified, simplified, and more robust African market. And I need to set this record straight because most often than not, scholars are always of the view that Africa forming their own free trade area will create a kind of a trade diversion away from their trading partners in outside Africa like India and China. But experience has shown that it will actually strengthen the union because these trading partners of Africa, India and China, to be precise now, will have a unified system, a robust African market where they can get more resources and then trade freely among themselves, since part of the agreement of the African Continental Free Trade Area is that they will have a common policy or agreement on how to deal with their non-members. So it's actually going to be a boost to India and China as against leading to create diversion, as most scholars proposes. Another one is that India and China exporting to Africa will increase by about 13.2% among themselves. And this was actually a finding made by Mishra in 2018. Now, what other implications will the African Continental Free Trade Area pose to India and China? It will cause India exports to Africa to increase by about 10% by the end of 2022, because it will provide Indian industries and companies a large market, a large and a more unified market with less restrictions and regulations, according to Mishra 2018. And although African exports might decrease elsewhere, following the creation of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership comprising of countries like Australia, Japan, China, India, Korea, New Zealand, and many other countries, African trade to the global market will definitely reduce because of these other economic integrations that are being formed that are parallel to the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, another one is that this is basically its implication to Africa particularly. Now, another implication of this African Continental Free Trade Area is that total African exports will also decrease if these mega regional trade agreements, that is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Communities, are established outside Africa. That means this union, African markets are not part of them. Definitely it will decrease African exports to other regions. Now, African exports might equally increase if this union is formed to be in partnership with African economies. Now, the conclusions I drew from this study are as follows. Number one, the main reason behind the creation of African Continental Free Trade Area is to boost Africans' intra-trade cooperation and fast-track the continent's all-inclusive development. This will actually be achieved if all member nations stick to the agreements of the economic union. Another one is that the purpose behind the establishment of African Continental Free Trade Area actually transcends regional economic cooperation. It can as well lead to political agreements and other kinds of benefits among African economy. The reluctance of some African economies, such as Nigeria, like I said before now, from signing the agreement implies that most African states are not sure about the prospects and the benefits that it can get from being partners to this integration. Then the benefits of African Continental Free Trade Area, notwithstanding, might not be sustained. That was one of the conclusions that this paper is made. Why will that be the case? It's due to the high political instabilities in the system, over-reliance of of African countries on the Western economics, and of course the cultural diversities and fear of dominance by other African countries. So these are the reasons why the benefits of the African Continental Free Trade Area might not be sustained in the long run. The above findings projects that following the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the India, Africa, and of course the China-African trade relations will be marginally affected as opposed to being negatively affected by most scholars in the past. And then finally, African exports will likely fall if the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area is followed or many other regions forms their own economic integration outside Africa. It will definitely affect African trade to other regions. Now, the recommendations that this study is making is that, number one, in order to mitigate the expected trade loss for African countries resulting from the establishment of other regional integration outside Africa, such as the MRTAs, especially the regional comprehensive agreements by India, China, Australia, like I mentioned before now, Africa must build a solid partnership among themselves to boost their respective bilateral trade and investment flows. Then secondly, India and Africa should try to target other markets because Africa seems to be the focus, especially China, the focus of these two economies. They should diversify attention to other regions of the world instead of just only African economy. And then the African Trade Policy Center and the various trading organizations in India and China must continue to work closely to identify the sectors that offer opportunities for development in Africa in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Reform. And then finally, African economies are advised to still maintain a good economic relationship with their previous trading partners, such as India and partner, without compromising their membership with the African Continental Free Trade Area. Thank you for listening. Hello, everyone. Hello. Hello.
Hi, Dr. Okoli.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Just got hold of Saki. They're saying that they are experiencing network problems in the venue where the event is.
Okay. Okay. I was presenting and I thought that my audience are following me. I didn't know that that you are not there. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, we also apologize for that. I think they will address you as soon as they are back online.
It's all right. Can I probably give a kind of a summary of the whole thing, maybe in 2-3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, if my audience.
Because I'm not in the venue, but I will call them and let them know.
Okay, okay.
So that as soon as they are back online, you can provide the summary.
Okay, okay, that's fine.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Hello, everyone.
Okay, this one says no.